circle to fight amongst themselves. He believed in a twisted version of social Darwinism. Only the most ruthless would survive and execute his will. There were no clear lines of authority. Ministries overlapped, commands contradicted each other, and betrayal was the currency of the Reich Chancellery. Every morning, these men woke up wondering not just how to defeat the Allies, but how to politically stab each other in the back. But when their agendas aligned, the results were devastatingly efficient. In this tactical breakdown, we pull back the curtain on the psychotic inner cabinet of the Third Reich, the strategists who built the empire, and whose massive egos eventually tore it down. Before a single tank could roll into Poland, Hitler needed to capture the minds of 80 million citizens. For that, he relied on a man with a severe physical limp, an immense inferiority complex, and an absolute genius for psychological warfare, Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Goebbels understood a fundamental rule of human psychology long before modern media existed. He famously stated that if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. He didn't just censor the press. He took absolute control of it. He subsidized the production of cheap radios, the Volksempfänger, ensuring that Hitler's voice penetrated every single living room, kitchen, and factory across Germany. Goebbels pioneered the art of the political spectacle. The massive Nuremberg rallies, designed with towering pillars of light reaching into the night sky, were his creations. He turned Goebbels' true strategic test came in 1943, after the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad. When morale was plummeting, he delivered his infamous total war speech at the Berlin Sportpalast. He asked the crowd, "Do you want total war? Do you want it more total and radical than anything we can even imagine today?" The crowd screamed in approval. Goebbels had successfully re-energized a dying population, turning a military disaster into a fanatical crusade that extended the war by 2 bloody years. While Goebbels managed the mind, the skies belonged to a former World War I fighter ace who became the second most powerful man in Germany, Hermann Göring, dressed in custom-designed, flamboyant uniforms covered in medals, and living a life of extreme luxury fueled by stolen art. Göring was the public face of Nazi military might. Hitler gave Göring unprecedented power. He was the chief of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, the head of the 4-year economic plan, and Hitler's officially designated successor. In the early days of World War II, Göring looked like a strategic mastermind. His Luftwaffe was the devastating tip of the Blitzkrieg spear, obliterating air forces in Poland, France, and the Low Countries. But Göring's massive ego would prove to be his strategic undoing. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, his arrogance blinded him. He promised Hitler he could crush the Royal Air Force in days. When British bombers launched a small, retaliatory raid on Berlin, a humiliated Göring, who had boasted that if a single bomb fell on Berlin, You can call me Meyer, shifted target from British airfields to civilian cities. This single tactical error gave the RAF time to recover, handing Germany its first major strategic defeat. As the war dragged on, Göring retreated into a fog of morphine addiction and luxury at his massive estate, Hall. He continuously lied to Hitler about aircraft production numbers, assuring the Führer that the Luftwaffe could supply the trapped Sixth Army at Stalingrad from the air. It was a physical impossibility. Göring's vanity left the German army starving in the snow, proving that his loyalty was never to tactical reality, but to his own survival in Hitler's good graces. If Hermann Göring was the loud, ostentatious face of the regime, Heinrich Himmler was its silent, terrifying ghost, a failed chicken farmer with an obsession for occultism and racial purity. Himmler looked more like a low-level schoolteacher than a mass murderer. Yet, he built a state within a state that executed the most horrific crimes in human history. The SS. Himmler was a master bureaucrat. He systematically took control of every police force in Germany, combining them with the SS and the Gestapo, while Hitler spoke in broad, ideological concepts about eliminating his enemies. Himmler was the technocrat who figured out the logistics. He transformed hatred into an industrial process. Under his direct command, the SS constructed and operated the vast network of concentration and extermination camps across occupied Europe. Himmler viewed this mass slaughter not as a crime, but as a historic, difficult duty. In a secret 1943 speech to SS officers in Posen, he called the extermination of the Jewish people a glorious page in our history that has never been written and shall never be written. Himmler's strategy was total control through absolute terror. His SS empire controlled factories, plundered resources, and held the entire population of occupied Europe under a continuous death warrant. By 1944, Himmler's power was so vast that his shadow loomed larger than Hitler's own generals, making him the true, terrifying engine driving the Third Reich's ideological war. By 1942, Nazi Germany was facing economic collapse. The Blitzkrieg had failed in Russia, and the country was now locked in an industrial war against the combined manufacturing power of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. To survive, Hitler turned to his young, brilliant personal architect, Albert Speer. Speer was appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production. Unlike the fanatical old guard of the Nazi Party, Speer was an educated, highly rational technocrat. He looked at the war purely as a data and logistics problem. He streamlined factories, eliminated bureaucratic red tape, and gave industrial managers direct authority over production lines. The results were terrifyingly effective. Under Speer's management, despite relentless, Allied strategic bombing campaigns that leveled German cities day and night, German weapons production didn't go down, it tripled. He produced more tanks, planes, and ammunition in 1944 than at any other point in the war. But Speer's economic miracle was built on a foundation of unadulterated human cruelty. To fuel his factories, he partnered directly with Heinrich Himmler to use millions of slave laborers from the concentration camps. Prisoners were worked to death in subterranean weapons factories, starved, and executed when their productivity dropped. Speer presented himself as an apolitical artist just doing his job, but he was the vital life support system that kept Hitler's genocide operating long after the war was strategically lost. April 1945, the final act, as Soviet artillery shells pounded the Reich Chancellery into dust. The internal structure of Hitler's brain trust fractured into complete chaos. Safe inside the subterranean concrete walls of the Führer bunker, the grand illusion was finally breaking down. One by one, the Vipers turned on their master and each other. Hermann Göring, safe in southern Germany, sent a telegram to the bunker asking if he should take over leadership of the Reich. Hitler, fueled by a final burst of paranoia and encouraged by Goebbels, flew into a rage, stripping Göring of all his titles and ordering his arrest for high treason. Days later, news reached the bunker that Heinrich Himmler, the man Hitler called Der True Heinrich, loyal Heinrich, had secretly attempted to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies behind the Führer's back. It was the ultimate psychological betrayal. Hitler ordered Himmler's execution, but the SS chief had already disappeared into the shadows, disguised as a common soldier. Only Joseph Goebbels remained completely loyal to the very end. On April 30th, after Hitler committed suicide, Goebbels briefly became chancellor of a ruined nation. One day later, refusing to live in a world without National Socialism, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children before committing suicide in the Chancellery Garden. Albert Speer chose a different path of survival, disobeying Hitler's final Nero decree, which ordered the total destruction of Germany's remaining infrastructure before surrendering to the Allies. The reckoning came at Nuremberg. Göring was sentenced to hang, but cheated the gallows by swallowing a hidden cyanide capsule hours before his execution. Himmler committed suicide shortly after being captured by British troops. Albert Speer served 20 years in prison, projecting a calculated myth of the good Nazi who knew nothing of the regime's worst crimes, a lie history would later thoroughly debunk. Hitler's brain trust proved that absolute evil does not require a single monster. It requires a network of ordinary men, intellectuals, bureaucrats, and administrators who willingly suspend their morality to serve a fanatical vision. Their legacy is not one of strategic genius, but an eternal warning of how easily civilized minds can organize the destruction of the world. Thanks for watching History Insignia TV. If you found this tactical, breakdown insightful, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop your thoughts in the comments below on which strategist was the most dangerous. See you in the next episode.
May 1945. The sirens across Europe finally fall silent. The Third Reich, a regime built on iron and blood, has collapsed into ash and ruin. Across London, Paris, and New York, millions flood the streets to toast to an hard-won era of peace. The long nightmare of the Second World War is over. But inside a locked, smoke-filled military headquarters in occupied Bavaria, the atmosphere is anything but celebratory. It is low. General George S. Patton Jr., the brilliant and erratic commander of the legendary United States Third Army, stands alone over a massive tactical map of Europe. His ivory-handled revolvers rest on his hips, and his fingers trace a red line directly past the broken borders of Germany, cutting straight through Poland and stopping dead on Moscow. While the world celebrates a new dawn, Patton is quietly calculating how many days it will take his battle-hardened tanks to reach the Kremlin. To him, the war hadn't ended. It had just been paused, and he wanted to unpause it. Turning to his inner staff, Patton muttered a phrase that would terrify Washington if it leaked. We're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Why not now, while our army is intact and our columns are hot? History books tell us the Cold War began years later, fought with shadow spies, proxy conflicts, and nuclear standoffs. But they completely omit a terrifying hidden window in May and June of 1945, where the world almost burned in a third world war, not because of a political crisis, but because a rogue American general was actively trying to start one. This is the untold story of Patton's secret rearmament of German troops, his illegal border provocations, and the frantic, undocumented scramble by Dwight D. Eisenhower to stop his own most dangerous general before he set the globe on fire. To understand the massive information gap hidden beneath the official history of their day, we have to look at the map of Europe exactly the way Patton saw it. The Red Army hadn't just captured Berlin. They had swallowed Eastern Europe whole. Millions of Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal total warfare against the Wehrmacht, stood organized and occupying everything from Prague to Vienna. Washington and the mainstream press viewed this as a monumental diplomatic triumph of the Allied coalition. General Patton, however, looked at the horizon with absolute horror. He saw a massive, totalitarian machine sitting right on the doorstep of a completely exhausted, bankrupt, and defenseless Western Europe. Patton's personal diaries, which were heavily censored for decades after his death, reveal an unsettling truth. He genuinely believed the Allied High Command was throwing away the very victory they had just spent years bleeding for. He wrote bitterly, "We have destroyed what could have been a barrier against communism and replaced it with a monstrous tyrant. Most generals obey foreign policy, but Patton believed he answered to a higher power and a self-proclaimed mystical destiny. He was entirely convinced he had lived past lives as a Greek hoplite, a Roman legionary, and a cavalryman under Napoleon. To him, the plains of Central Europe were just another historic canvas where he was destined to conquer an empire. By mid-May, Patton decided he wasn't going to wait for a green light from political bureaucrats in Washington. He began taking secret, highly unauthorized practical steps to prepare his Third Army for a sudden offensive eastward. This is where the standard historical narrative completely breaks down into a hidden conspiracy. As part of the official surrender agreements, Patton's forces had rounded up hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war. Supreme Allied protocol dictated these men were to be immediately disarmed, logged, stripped of their military structures, and placed into labor camps. But Patton gave his corps commanders an astonishing verbal directive that defied every treaty signed by the United States. He ordered them to maintain the internal command structures of select German panzer and veteran infantry divisions entirely intact. German officers kept their uniforms, their men, and their organization. Even more shocking, German military mechanics were quietly ordered to keep servicing their Panther and Tiger tanks, their half-tracks, and their heavy artillery pieces instead of dismantling them. To any outside inspector, it appeared the Third Army was simply suffering from a massive logistical bottleneck in processing the sheer volume of surrendering troops. In reality, Patton was preserving a highly disciplined, fanatically anti-communist ghost army. He openly told his inner circle, "We can weaponize them, integrate them into our own armored columns, and push the Red Army back across the Volga in a matter of weeks." It was a gamble that completely violated the Yalta agreements. If Soviet intelligence got wind of it, the alliance would instantly rupture, triggering a hot war on the spot. And Patton wasn't content with just waiting for the spark. He went out to find it. By late May, he took his most dangerous step yet by ordering unauthorized high-altitude tactical reconnaissance flights. American scout planes crossed directly over the demarcation lines, photographing Soviet supply hubs, bridge deployments, and troop concentrations deep within the Soviet zone. On the ground, Patton's four war carry units began conducting incredibly aggressive border patrols, intentionally pushing into unmapped gray zones. On several occasions, American and Soviet armored cars stood bumper to bumper on isolated dirt roads, weapons drawn, waiting for someone's finger to slip. Patton wasn't trying to avoid an incident. He was actively hunting for a border clash to use as a justification to launch his tanks. He told his command group, "If they start a fight, I will finish it right in their own backyard." Barely Juni reports of Patton's rogue logistical maneuvers and hostile Border patrols, finally, leaked north to the Supreme Allied headquarters in Frankfurt. General Dwight D. Eisenhower read the intelligence intercepts with absolute dread. I could spend years managing the volatile egos of the global alliance on a knife's edge. He knew that if Patton moved just one single tank division past the line, the fragile post-war peace would shatter instantly. Eisenhower immediately bypassed standard channels, picked up the secure line, and ordered Patton to report to his headquarters under total secrecy. What followed was an explosive, closed-door confrontation between the two old friends. Eisenhower screamed at Patton, demanding to know why he was keeping organized German divisions on the payroll. Patton fired back, accusing the politicians of cowardice, famously shouting that they would eventually have to fight the Soviets anyway, so they might as well do it while the US held the industrial upper hand. Eisenhower had to make a choice to save global stability. He had to break his most successful combat general. Within weeks, Patton was quietly but systematically stripped of his beloved Third Army Command and reassigned to a meaningless desk job overseeing a military history group. The man who had conquered Europe was effectively neutralized. Just months later, in December 1945, General Patton was riding in his staff car on his way to a pheasant hunt in Germany when a military truck suddenly collided with his vehicle at a low-speed intersection. It was a minor crash that left everyone else unhurt. But Patton was thrown forward, breaking his neck. 12 days later, the unstoppable general died in a hospital bed, paralyzed from the neck down. To this day, historians debate whether that crash was a tragic coincidence, a finale, dark mechanism used by a desperate world to ensure the mad general could never start the war he so deeply craved. The monument to Patton stands today in Luxembourg, but the true lesson of May 1945 remains hidden in the shadows. That sometimes the most terrifying threat to peace isn't the enemy you face, but the unstoppable warrior fighting right beside you. Please comment your opinion in the below comment box.
But deploying an inflatable tank was an art form in itself. The artists quickly realized that a pristine, perfectly clean tank sitting in a field looked suspicious. Real tanks were filthy. They tore up the landscape. So, the men of the Ghost Army would spend hours using shovels and specialized tools to dig artificial tank tracks into the mud, leading up to the rubber decoys. If a dummy tank was placed under a camouflage net, it had to be done poorly on purpose. The artists understood the psychology of the German observers. If a position was too perfectly hidden, it looked fake. If it was slightly exposed, as if by a careless soldier, the German intelligence officers would believe they had made a brilliant discovery. The second pillar was sonic deception, perhaps the most technologically advanced and terrifyingly effective tool in their arsenal. The military recognized that in the dense forests and foggy valleys of Europe, soldiers often heard an army before they saw it. To exploit this, the army partnered with Bell Laboratories to create a massive, high-fidelity sound library. Engineers recorded the authentic sounds of every imaginable military activity. They spent weeks at armored bases, recording the clatter of tank tracks turning on gravel, the screech of brakes, the profane shouting of mechanics, the building of pontoon bridges, and the idling engines of entire infantry regiments. These sounds were pressed onto massive, experimental 16-inch theater records, to play them in the combat zone. The Ghost Army was equipped with state-of-the-art wire recorders and colossal 250-pound speakers designed by the military. These speakers were mounted on the backs of armored half-tracks. The acoustic projection was immense. Under the right atmospheric conditions, these sound trucks could project the convincing illusion of an entire armored division moving through the night, up to 15 miles away. The men operating these sound trucks faced an extraordinary psychological burden. They would drive through the pitch-black European nights, completely alone on deserted roads, blasting the sound of a massive tank advance through the fog. They knew that if the Germans believed the sound, an immediate barrage of heavy artillery would rain down directly on their unarmored half-tracks. They were literally daring the enemy to kill them with sound. The third pillar was radio deception, known officially as spoof radio. The German military possessed highly sophisticated signals intelligence units that monitored allied radio frequencies around the clock. They could identify the unique rhythm and style of individual radio operators, a characteristic known as an operator's fist. The radio operators of the Ghost Army were masters of mimicry. They would study the exact radio procedures, call signs, and operators' habits of real divisions that were currently stationed miles away. When that real division moved out to conduct a secret attack, the Ghost Army's radio team would step into the vacuum. They would stay behind and generate a massive web of fake radio traffic. They would talk about mundane logistics, complain about the weather, request fuel deliveries, and transmit encrypted orders that they knew the Germans would intercept and crack. To the German codebreakers in Berlin, it appeared undeniable that the veteran division was still sitting safely in its original position, when in reality, that division was already 20 miles away, preparing a devastating surprise assault. The fourth and final pillar was atmosphere, what the actors of the 23rd called the scenic effects. This was the connective tissue that bound the entire lie together. The artists realized that an army is not just machines and radio waves. It is made of human beings. If German spies or sympathetic civilians in occupied towns looked closely, they would notice the details. Therefore, the men of the Ghost Army would put on fake uniform patches, identifying themselves as members of elite divisions like the 2nd Armored or the 75th Infantry. They would drive their trucks in continuous loops through French and Belgian villages, changing the bumper markings on each pass to make it look like thousands of troops were moving through. Their officers would walk into local cafes and taverns, deliberately dropping hints about upcoming operations, knowing that the bartenders or patrons might be informants for the German intelligence network. They created an entire ecosystem of gossip, movement, and visual clutter that made the Phantom Army feel alive. The true test of this bizarre experiment came in September of 1944. During the brutal fighting along the Moselle River, the American Third Army, commanded by the aggressive General George S. Patton, was pushing hard against the fortified city of Metz. Patton's armor was moving fast, but his lines were stretched dangerously thin. A massive 20-mile gap opened up in the American line near the town of Thionville. German intelligence picked up on the vulnerability. The lethal German Panzerwaffe began massing its remaining armor, preparing to launch a catastrophic counter-offensive through that undefended gap to cut Patton's army in half. If they broke through, the American advance would grind to a halt, and thousands of men would be trapped. The only force available to fill that 20-mile void was the 1,200 artists and technicians of the Ghost Army. They received their orders in the middle of the night, rushed to Thionville, hold the line, and convince the German army that a massive, American armored juggernaut was waiting for them. The men arrived in the dark, working in frantic, disciplined silence, while the visual team unrolled their rubber tanks and inflated them with air compressors under the cover of the trees. The sonic team positioned their massive speaker trucks along the riverbanks. The radio operators filled the airwaves with a symphony of fake military traffic, announcing the arrival of the fictitious vanguard of the American armor. As the sun rose over the Moselle River, the illusion was set. To the German scouts looking across the water, the American line looked impenetrable. They saw the distinct profiles of Sherman tanks peeking out from the brush. They saw tracks gouged deep into the mud. They heard the terrifying, low-frequency rumble of armored engines warming up across the river. The German commanders hesitated. Their aerial reconnaissance confirmed the presence of a massive force. According to their calculations, attacking this position would be suicidal. Instead of driving through the open gap, the German panzers halted their advance, dug into defensive positions, and began firing their heavy artillery across the river at the rubber tanks. The artists huddled in their shallow foxholes, listening to the terrifying shriek of incoming German 88mm shells. They watched as their meticulously painted rubber tanks were blasted into shreds of smoking fabric. But every shell that hit a rubber decoy was a shell that did not hit a living American soldier. For several days, the 1,200 men of the Ghost Army successfully held a 20-mile gap against a veteran armored force, using nothing but air, sound, and unyielding courage. By the time the German command realized they had been fighting a phantom, the real American reinforcements had arrived, sealing the gap and securing the flank. But the Ghost Army's masterpiece, their most dangerous and consequential operation, was yet to come. It took place in March of 1945 during the final, desperate push into the heart of Germany, Operation Plunder. The objective was the Rhine River, the historic, sacred barrier of the German homeland. The British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was preparing a massive, million-man assault to cross the river at the city of Wesel. Was to be a highly coordinated, devastating set-piece battle. The problem was that the Germans knew Montgomery was coming. They had heavily fortified the opposite bank, positioning their fiercest remaining infantry, artillery, and anti-tank units directly in his path. If Montgomery launched his crossing against those prepared defenses, the casualties would be catastrophic. The Allies needed a miracle to draw those German guns away from Wesel. The Ghost Army was called upon to deliver that miracle. Their mission, codenamed Operation Viersen, was their largest and most complex deception of the war. They were ordered to convince the German High Command that the main American crossing of the Rhine would not take place at Wesel, but 10 miles to the south, near the city of Viersen. This was a monumental task. They had to simulate not just a few tanks, but 2 entire divisions, the 30th Infantry and the 79th Infantry, totaling over 30,000 men. The 1,200 artists of the Ghost Army moved into the area, transforming the landscape into a massive, bustling staging area. They inflated hundreds of dummy tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. They set up fake supply depots, using canvas and wood to mimic mountains of ammunition crates. They lit fake campfires at night, and left real garbage scattered around. To make the positions look inhabited, the sonic team pulled off an engineering marvel. They mixed multiple tracks of recorded sound, creating a continuous, terrifyingly realistic audio landscape of thousands of men building pontoon bridges, launching assault boats and moving heavy machinery down to the water's edge. For nights on end, they blasted this auditory nightmare into the fog of the Rhine. The deception worked with devastating perfection. The German High Command swallowed the bait completely. Believing that the main Allied hammer was about to fall on Viersen, they ordered their artillery, batteries, and their remaining elite troops to shift 10 miles south, away from Montgomery's actual objective. They aimed their guns at the Phantom Army, waiting for an attack that would never come. On the night of March 23, 1945, Montgomery's real forces launched their assault at Wesel because the German defenses had been stripped and moved south to fight the Ghosts. The British troops crossed the Rhine with astonishingly light resistance. The crossing was a spectacular success, cracking open the final natural defense of the Nazi regime and paving the way for the total collapse of the Western Front. The 1,200 artists of the Ghost Army had successfully blindsided the entire German High Command, saving thousands of lives in the process. When the war in Europe finally came to an end in May of 1945, the men of the 23rd Headquarters, Special Troops, did not receive a victory parade. They were not allowed to tell their wives, their parents, or their children what they had done. The Pentagon took every blueprint, every sound recording, every after-action report, and stamped it with the highest level of military classification. The Cold War was beginning, and the American military recognized that the techniques perfected by the Ghost Army, the psychological manipulation, the acoustic engineering, the electronic warfare were weapons that might need to be used again. The artists were ordered to return to civilian life and bury their memories deep in the shadows. For over 50 years, the official history of the Ghost Army simply did not exist. The men who had used creativity to defeat tyranny went on to shape the cultural fabric of post-war America. Bill Blass revolutionized the fashion industry, bringing a distinct, modern American style to the runways of the world. Ellsworth Kelly redefined abstract art. His massive, bold blocks of color hanging in the world's most prestigious museums, ironically, a style born from his wartime experiments with shape and space observation. Arthur Singer's illustrations of birds educated generations of nature lovers. Yet, for decades, whenever these men were asked about their time in the war, they could only give vague, generic answers. They told people they had been stationed in Europe, or that they worked in camouflage. They could not explain that they had stood in the freezing mud of the Ardennes, holding off German panzers with rubber balloons. They could not tell anyone that they had saved the lives of their fellow soldiers using stagecraft. It was not until 1996 that the United States government finally declassified the files of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. The world finally learned the truth about the 1,200 men who had staged 24 separate combat operations directly on the front lines, risking their lives without any traditional weapons to protect them. The legacy of the Ghost Army is a profound testament to a different kind of courage. In a conflict defined by industrial slaughter, massive artillery barrages, and the brute force of iron and steel, these men proved that intellect, creativity, and sheer audacity could alter the course of history. They did not conquer territory through destruction. They conquered it through imagination. They stared down the terrifying power of the German Panzerwaffe, looked into the abyss of the 20th century's darkest hour, and won their battles by pulling off the greatest magic trick the world has ever seen. Please write your opinion in the comment box. Thank you.
October 22nd, 1946. 3 o'clock in the morning. Deep inside the Soviet-occupied zone of a shattered post-war Germany. The freezing autumn silence is suddenly broken by the heavy thud of military boots. Thousands of Soviet Red Army soldiers, backed by the notorious NKVD secret police, fan out across the ruined streets of Berlin, Dresden, and Leipzig. They are carrying pre-printed lists, loaded submachine guns, and an order signed directly by Joseph Stalin. They approach the homes of Germany's most brilliant minds, the rocket scientists, nuclear physicists, jet propulsion engineers, and chemical experts who had spent the last decade building Adolf Hitler's terrifying wonder weapons. Without warning, doors are kicked off their hinges. Families are dragged from their beds in their pajamas, staring into the cold steel of Soviet bayonets. The orders given to them are brief, terrifying, and non-negotiable. You have exactly 2 hours to pack your belongings. You, your wife, your children, and your furniture are being moved. Do not ask where. Do not resist. By sunrise, more than 90 military trains are already steaming eastward toward the frozen depths of the Soviet Union. Packed inside are over 2,000 top-tier German scientists and nearly 6,000 of their family members. They were not being arrested for war crimes. They were being stolen. This was the beginning of Operation Osoviakim. It remains the largest, most aggressive force technology transfer in human history. Yet, if you open a standard Western history textbook, you will barely find a single footnote about it. We are taught extensively about America's Operation Paperclip, how the United States brought Nazi scientists like Werner von Braun to NASA to build the Apollo rockets. But history has conveniently ignored the darker, far more ruthless mirror image of that operation. The night Joseph Stalin literally kidnapped the brains of the Third Reich to kickstart the Soviet space program and the nuclear arms race. For the next hour, we are going to expose the classified files that Moscow kept buried for over half a century. We will look at the desperate, high-stakes intelligence war between East and West, where human beings were treated as the ultimate plunder of war. We will uncover how a collection of captive Nazi engineers, working under the constant threat of the Siberian gulags, actually built the foundations for the Soviet Union to launch Sputnik, stun the Western world, and nearly win the Cold War before America even realized the game had begun. To truly understand how this terrifying night unfolded, we have to look at the secret race that began long before the final artillery shells fell on Berlin. By early 1945, the leaders of the Allied nations knew the German military was finished. The question was no longer if Germany would fall, but who would capture its terrifying technological secrets. The Third Reich had achieved breakthroughs in military science that were decades ahead of their time. They had developed the Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. They had created nerve agents like Tabun and Sarin. And most importantly, they had built the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. A weapon that could rain terror down on London from hundreds of miles away, traveling faster than the speed of sound, with absolutely no defense against it. Both Washington and Moscow realized a fundamental truth. Whoever controlled Germany's rocket scientists would control the future of global warfare. The United States launched Operation Overcast, which later became Operation Paperclip. Their strategy was simple but highly effective. American intelligence teams used a secret document called the Ozenberg List, a compilation of Germany's top scientific minds to track down these engineers before the Soviets could find them. The Americans offered these scientists a choice: come to the United States, receive full immunity for your wartime activities, get lucrative government contracts, and help us fight communism. For men facing starvation in a ruined Europe or execution by vengeful Allied courts, it was an easy choice. But Joseph Stalin was watching this with growing fury. He felt betrayed by his Western allies. The Soviet Union had borne the heaviest burden of the war, losing over 27 million citizens. Yet, the Americans were using their wealth and geographical advantage to sweep up the finest scientific minds of Germany, leaving the Soviets with ruined factories and empty laboratories. Stalin summoned his chief of Sixth Police, Lavrenti Barry-Malone, struck to the heart's hair in millions. Stalin's directive was absolute. We cannot allow the Americans to hold a monopoly on German brain power. If the scientists will not come to us voluntarily, we will take them. Initially, the Soviets tried to play the diplomatic game. In the immediate months following VE Day, they set up specialized research bureaus inside occupied Germany, such as the Rabe Institute in Bleicherode. They paid German scientists high wages, gave them extra food rations, and allowed them to continue their research on the V to rocket under Soviet supervision. Many German engineers, thinking they were safe and could rebuild their lives in their homeland, willingly took these jobs. They believed they were partners in a joint scientific venture. It was a brilliant, calculated trap. By late summer of 1946, the Soviet High Command decided that keeping these scientists in Germany was too dangerous. The borders between the Allied occupation zones were still fluid. Western spies were constantly slipping into the Soviet zone, offering German engineers secret passage to the West. Stalin realized that at any moment, his prized intellectual prisoners could defect to the United States. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Kremlin. The voluntary phase was over. The entire German scientific infrastructure within the Soviet zone had to be liquidated and physically transported deep inside Russia, where no Western spy could ever reach them. The date for the operation was chosen with surgical precision, October 22nd. The Soviets waited until the local elections in Berlin had concluded, so the massive military movement wouldn't cause a diplomatic panic before the votes were cast. When the clock struck 3 a.m., the trap snapped shut. Imagine being one of those scientists. You are asleep next to your wife. Your children are in the next room. Suddenly, the silence is shattered by heavy fists pounding on your door. You open it to find a Soviet officer accompanied by armed guards. He does not read you your rights. He reads an official decree from the Soviet military administration. It states that you have been reassigned to a new facility in the East, effective immediately. The psychological warfare used that night was devastating. The Soviets purposely gave the families an impossibly short window, usually between 1 and 2 hours, to pack everything they owned. Why? Because a panicked human being cannot think rationally. If you are rushing to pack your clothes, your children's toys, and your valuable research papers under the glare of a loaded rifle, You do not have time to plan an escape. You do not have time to call for help. And you do not have time to resist. To prevent riots or mass panic, the Soviets resorted to a bizarre form of forced hospitality, while soldiers stood guard with submachine guns. Military trucks parked outside were loaded not just with suitcases, but with the family's actual furniture. Bed frames, dining tables, pianos, and wardrobes were loaded into the back of transport vehicles. The message was clear. We are taking your life, but we are letting you keep your things. But where were they going? No one would tell them. As the convoys rolled through the dark, devastated streets of Germany toward the railway stations, the German captives looked out the windows and saw a terrifying sight. The operation was happening everywhere simultaneously. The entire scientific elite of a nation was being scrubbed from the map in a matter of hours. At the train stations, the true horror of their situation became undeniable. They were forced onto long lines of freight and passenger trains that had been requisitioned by the military. The doors were locked from the outside. Armed guards took positions at the end of every carriage. As the steam engines hissed and the trains began their long, agonizing journey toward the east, crossing the Polish border and heading toward the Soviet frontier, the German scientists realized the bitter truth. They were no longer respected professionals. They were state property. They were entering a world of total isolation, completely cut off from the rest of humanity, with no guarantee that they would ever see their homeland again. If you want from me to upload the full part of this story, then please, write next part in the comment box.
Beneath the quiet amber wheat fields of Volgograd, under the roots of ancient, silent pines outside St. Petersburg, and deep within the dark, suffocating swamps of the Volkhov River, millions of heartbeats are frozen in time. They are not merely names written on stone monuments, nor are they abstract statistics safely preserved in dust-covered archives. They are real flesh, real bone, real teeth, and real iron, pressed tight into the cold earth, under the crushing weight of 80 years of silence. Every single year, as the spring thaw softens the soil or the autumn rain washes away the topsoil, the earth gives way. A rusted steel helmet breaks through the mud like an island. A leather boot, preserved by the chemical composition of the bog, emerges with the gray skeleton of a foot still laced tightly inside. A polished zinc identification tag catches a stray beam of sunlight, glinting with the encoded numbers of a unit that ceased to exist in the winter of 1942. To the casual observer, this is a graveyard. To the politician, it is a patriotic symbol. To the black market scavenger, it is a gold mine of sellable militaria. But to the historical forensic investigator, it is a crime scene that has never been properly closed. This reality forces us to confront a heavy, deeply uncomfortable question that divides historians, families, and nations alike. Do we have the moral right to disturb the resting places of the fallen? Does digging up a dead soldier honor his memory by returning his name to history? Or does it violate the ultimate sanctuary of the grave? Where exactly does the line sit between respecting the dead and uncovering the absolute? Raw historical truth The world of battlefield exhumation is a dark, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying space where the living must bargain with the dead. For decades, the official history is written by victorious nations painted World War II in broad, triumphant strokes of grand strategy and clean heroism. But the shovel does not care about propaganda. The shovel does not read textbook chapters. When you dig into the earth of the Eastern Front, the pristine myth of the clean soldier instantly shatters. You find things that governments tried desperately to erase. You find German soldiers who died not from glorious combat, but from eating their own leather belts out of starvation. You find Soviet soldiers buried in mass pits by their own commanders, executed for retreating a single step. You find young boys, barely 16 years old, carrying pocket knives, photographs of smiling mothers and Lucky Charms, buried alongside the very weapons of mass destruction that took their lives. There is a powerful, almost religious taboo against disturbing human remains. Across nearly every culture on Earth, the grave is sacred. We are taught from childhood to let the dead rest in peace. Yet, every summer, hundreds of organized search teams, forensic anthropologists, and historians deliberately drive steel, shovels into the ground to pull these men back into the light of day. They do this because leaving them there means allowing the final victory of war to stand. It means allowing total erasure. When a soldier vanishes into the mud, unrecognized and unaccounted for, he is killed twice. The first death is physical, caused by bullet, shrapnel, or frostbite. The second death is historical, caused by the absolute oblivion of being forgotten. Exhumation is the only weapon we have against that second permanent death. But the process is a moral minefield. With every layer of soil peeled back, the investigator holds the heavy weight of a human life in their hands. Is it right to look into a man's final terrified moments? Is it ethical to expose his shattered skull to a camera lens? When we scrub the mud off a rusted SS badge or a Soviet Red Star, are we preserving history? Or are we feeding an unhealthy obsession with the aesthetics of violence? This is the true story of what happens when the earth is forced to speak. It is the story of the quiet, meticulous, and agonizing work of battlefield archaeology. It is an exploration of the brutal tension between our duty to the dead, who demand silence, and our duty to the living, who demand the truth. To understand why men must dig, one must first understand how so many millions were lost to the geography of the earth in the first place. The Eastern Front of World War II was not a localized conflict. It was an industrial slaughterhouse that stretched across thousands of miles of wilderness, steppe, forest, and ruin. In the chaos of retreats, encirclements, and sudden bombardments, the administrative machinery of death completely broke down. When an army is advancing, it takes the time to bury its dead. It digs neat rows of graves, marks them with wooden crosses or stenciled boards, and logs the coordinates in meticulous field journals. But when an army is routed, or when a position changes hands 5 times in 48 hours, the dead are abandoned exactly where they fell. Consider the pocket of Demyansk, or the vast, bloody cauldron of Stalingrad. In those spaces, thousands of men were instantly, vaporized by artillery, or buried. Alive when trenches collapsed. Under the weight of advancing tanks, thousands more froze to death in deep foxholes during the brutal sub-zero winters, their bodies turning to solid ice before the snow drifted over them, sealing them away like pale statues until the following spring. When the war ended in 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins and mass displacement. Millions of families were left with a single, agonizing piece of paper from the military bureaucracy that read, "Missing in action." This phrase is perhaps the most cruel sentence ever devised by military administration. It provides no closure, no finality, and no peace. It leaves a permanent, bleeding question mark over generations of a family. Did he die instantly? Did he languish in a Siberian gulag? Did he starve in a transit camp? For 80 years, those question marks have remained buried in the soil. The official statistics tell us that over 2 million German soldiers remain unaccounted for, and upwards of 4 million Soviet soldiers are still missing, scattered across the vast expanses of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. They are the Phantom Army, a population of ghosts larger than many modern cities, completely integrated into the natural landscape. Over the decades, nature did what it does best. It reclaimed the land. Trees grew through the rib cages of fallen infantrymen. The roots of oaks wrapped themselves tightly around the rusted barrels of Mauser rifles and the buckles of leather equipment. Silt settled in the bottom of bomb craters, turning them into peaceful, stagnant forest ponds. To the untrained eye, a modern forest outside of Vyazma looks like a pristine paradise. But just 6 inches beneath the moss lies a continuous layer of human bone and metal. This is where the conflict between memory and myth begins. During the Soviet era, the narrative of the Great Patriotic War was highly sanitized. The state required a myth of collective, flawless heroism. The reality of millions of unburied, rotting corpses left in the forest did not fit the glorious imagery of bronze monuments and eternal flames. As a result, vast battlefields were intentionally ignored or sealed off. In places like the Second Shock Army's disaster at Mayersnoye, where tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers were cut to pieces in the swamps due to the incompetence of high command. The state chose silence. The dead were left where they lay, treated as potential traitors because they had been surrounded or captured, their names completely scrubbed from official history. Leaving the dead in the ground was not an act of respect. It was an act of political convenience. It was a deliberate strategy of enforced oblivion. When modern search teams enter these spaces today, they are not merely performing archaeological science. They are performing an act of historical defiance. They are forcing the earth to surrender the secrets that powerful regimes tried to bury forever. When a forensic team approaches a potential exhumation site, the romantic notions of history immediately vanish, replaced by the cold, precise reality of archaeological science. The work is slow, physically punishing, and intellectually exhausting. It begins long before a single shovel strikes the dirt. It begins with old maps, aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by the Luftwaffe, after-action reports and satellite imagery that reveals the faint, geometric outlines of long-forgotten trench systems hidden beneath modern vegetation. Once your site is identified, the field methodology must be flawless. This is not treasure hunting. It is a crime scene investigation where the witnesses died 8 decades ago. The topsoil is cleared away with extreme care, inch by inch, using small hand trowels, brushes, and wooden scrapers. Metal detectors are used continuously, not to find valuable souvenirs, but to track the metallic trail of combat-spent shell casings, shrapnel fragments, and personal gear that indicate the exact position of a body. The way a skeleton lies in the earth tells a highly specific story of their final moments. Forensic anthropologists can read the bones like a text. If the remains are found face down, with limbs drawn inward tightly, it suggests the soldier was cowering in a foxhole, trying to make himself as small as possible to escape an incoming artillery. Perish before the wall collapsed and suffocated him. If the bones are scattered across a wide area, mixed with jagged, torn fragments of steel, it reveals the catastrophic impact of a direct mortar hit. The soil itself acts as both an enemy and an ally to historical truth. In highly acidic pine forests, human bones dissolve completely within a few decades, leaving behind nothing but a dark, ghostly shadow in the earth and a collection of metallic items, buttons, belt buckles, and boot nails that map out where the man once lay. But in the alkaline, waterlogged bogs of the northern sectors, the lack of oxygen creates a bizarre, eerie level of preservation. In these bogs, teams occasionally find what are known as mummies. These are bodies where the skin, hair, clothing, and even internal organs have been preserved by the natural tannins of the swamp. When you clear away the dark, wet peat from such a find, you are suddenly looking at a human face. You can see the stubble on his chin, the expression of terror or exhaustion frozen on his lips, and the fabric of his uniform perfectly intact, down to the colored stitching on his collar tabs. It is a moment that completely paralyzes everyone on the site. The distance between the past and the present instantly evaporates. You are no longer looking at an artifact or a historical subject. You are looking at a person who was alive, who had a name, a voice, and a home, looking back at you across 80 years of lost time. In these profound moments, the ethical weight of the work hits the investigator with immense force. Do we have the right to look at this man? Do we have the right to strip away the protective blanket of the earth that has held him for nearly a century? The justification for this intrusion rests almost entirely on a single vital object, the identification tag. For a German soldier, this was the oval aluminum or zinc Koningsmark, stamped with his unit number and personal roster code, designed to be broken in half upon his death. For a Soviet soldier, especially in the early years of the war, it was the Bakelite capsule, a small black plastic cylinder containing a tightly rolled slip of paper where the soldier was supposed to write his name, home address, and next of kin. These small objects are the holy grail of battlefield exhumation. They are the keys that unlock the prison of anonymity. If an identification tag is found alongside the remains, the cold, anonymous skeleton suddenly transforms back into a human being with a biography. He becomes Joseph Weber, a 21-year-old watchmaker's apprentice from Munich, who loved drawing and hated the cold. He becomes Nikolai Smirnov, a 19-year-old tractor driver from a small village near Kazan, whose mother spent 30 years looking out the window, hoping against all hope that her boy would walk down the dirt road and return home. Without the deliberate act of exhumation, these names would remain lost forever. The science of the soil is the only mechanism capable of translating raw, anonymous human remains back into historical truth. But what happens when that truth is deeply uncomfortable? What happens when the artifact we dig up is not a symbol of a victim, but the emblem of a perpetrator? This brings us directly to the most controversial and highly charged aspect of battlefield archaeology: the identification of insignias and symbols. On the Eastern Front, the ideological nature of the war meant that symbols were not mere decorative uniform additions. They were powerful, explicit statements of political intent, racial theory, and military fanaticism. When a search team clears the mud from a skeleton and reveals a silver skull and crossbones, the Totenkoffer, the runic SS, insignia on a collar tab or steel helmet, the entire atmosphere of the excavation changes instantly. This is no longer just a tragic story of a young life cut short. This is the physical uncovering of an apparatus of terror. Here lies the deep paradox of historical truth versus respect for the dead. Every human being, regardless of the cause they fought for, is arguably entitled to a dignified burial under international law and basic human decency. But history is not neutral. The bones of an SS soldier who participated in the burning of villages, the mass execution of civilians, and the systematic erasure of populations carry a fundamentally different historical weight than the bones of a conscripted farm boy. There is a disturbing trend in modern popular history and digital media that focuses heavily on the aesthetics of these wartime symbols. The internet is filled with forums, video channels, and collectors who romanticize Nazi militaria, obsessing over the design of badges, the quality of uniforms, and the elite status of specific units. When an exhumation video shows the discovery of an SS ring or a rare combat badge, the view counts skyrocket, often accompanied by comments that glorify the German war machine. This is where the duty of the historical investigator becomes critical. The exhumation must never be allowed to become a glorification of the symbol. If you show the silver badge, you must also show the absolute misery that accompanied it. You must show that the man wearing that elite badge died like an animal in a dirt hole, abandoned by his leaders, shivering in rags, surrounded by the physical evidence of his own destruction. True forensic archaeology acts as an aggressive antidote to military romanticism. When you look at the physical reality of an exhumation site, there is no glory. There is only shattered bone, rotted leather, rusted iron, and the terrible smell of wet earth mixed with ancient decay. The glamorous images found in wartime propaganda magazines are completely exposed as a lie by the shovel. Furthermore, the artifacts found alongside these symbols often reveal deep, hidden truths about the nature of the war that the official histories ignore. For instance, in many German graves from 1943 onward, investigators find a massive amount of looted civilian property, women's silver rings, hidden in pocket watches, stolen icons from Russian Orthodox churches, and civilian pocket knives. These items, found directly on the bodies of dead soldiers, provide undeniable physical proof of the widespread plunder and criminality that defined the daily reality of the advancing German army. On the Soviet side, the iconography reveals its own complex hidden narratives. For decades, Soviet propaganda maintained that every soldier died with the name of Stalin on his lips, completely devoted to the communist cause. But when you exhume the bodies of Soviet infantrymen, you frequently find a very different reality. Hidden inside their boots, or sewn deep into the linings of their coats to hide them from political officers. Investigators find small handmade brass crosses, handwritten prayers on scraps of paper, and hidden religious icons. These men, facing the absolute terror of industrial warfare, did not find comfort in state ideology. They clung desperately to the forbidden faith of their ancestors. By uncovering these symbols and personal items, exhumation tears down the simplified, cartoonish versions of history taught in classrooms. It replaces propaganda with the complicated, messy, and human reality of the individuals who fought and died. It forces us to see these men not as monolithic icons of good or evil, but as complex human beings caught within a monstrous historical machine. But does exposing this reality justify the physical act of digging them up? To truly understand the ethical debate surrounding this work, we must listen to the voices of those who believe that battlefield exhumation is a fundamental violation of human dignity. This perspective is rooted in a profound ancient philosophy. The grave is a permanent sanctuary, an absolute boundary line that the living have no right to cross. From this point of view, when a soldier dies in battle and is covered by the earth, that location becomes his final resting place. It does not matter if it is a formal military cemetery or a random foxhole in a forgotten forest. The ground has accepted him. Over 80 years, he has become a part of the landscape. To drive a shovel into that space, to pull his skeleton out of the dirt, to separate his skull from his ribs, and to spread his bones across a plastic tarp for analysis is seen as an act of profound disrespect. This argument is particularly powerful when it comes to the issue of documentation and media consumption. Today, we live in an era where everything is recorded, shared, and monetized. Many exhumation groups film their excavations for online platforms. When a video displays the skeletal remains of a soldier, his hollow eye socket staring into a camera lens, while an online audience scrolls past, does that honor him? Or does it reduce a human tragedy into clickbait, visual entertainment, and content for consumption? Has the pursuit of historical truth simply become a cover for a morbid digital voyeurism? There are many descendants of missing soldiers who explicitly prefer that their ancestors be left alone. For them, the idea of their grandfather's bones being handled by comfort in the idea that their relative rests in the quiet peace of nature, undisturbed by the noise and politics of the modern world. They believe that the earth is the most dignified monument a fallen soldier can ever have. This argument gains even more. Wait, when we look at the commercial side of battlefield scavenging, in Eastern Europe, a massive illegal market exists for wartime relics. These are legal diggers, known colloquially as black archaeologists, care absolutely nothing for history, respect, or identity. They hunt exclusively for medals, helmets, and weapons that can be sold to private collectors on international online auctions. When these black archaeologists find a body, they routinely rip the identification tags from the neck, smash the skull to check for gold teeth, and scatter the remaining bones across the forest floor like garbage. For these scavengers, the dead are simply an obstacle to getting to the valuable metal. The tragic reality is that the tools, techniques, and locations used by legitimate historical search teams are often identical to those used by these criminal grave robbers to the casual observer or the local community. The sight of men in camouflage gear digging deep holes in the forest looks exactly the same, whether they are driven by historical science or financial greed. By normalizing the excavation of battlefields, do legitimate historians inadvertently provide a cover and a justification for the illegal desecration of these graves? This is the core ethical dilemma. The line between a respectful forensic recovery and a disrespectful grave violation is razor thin, dependent entirely on the intent, method, and integrity of the people holding the shovel. If the primary goal is simply to find cool artifacts or create viral